In the early 1990s, as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union crumbled, a wave of democracy swept across Africa. In Kenya, that struggle found its most vocal champion in Raila Odinga. Once a young activist defying an authoritarian state, he became a central figure in Kenya's long, turbulent journey toward multi-party democracy. To his supporters, he was Kenya's Nelson Mandela. Raila was a man who never stopped believing in democracy, no matter how many times the system seemed rigged against him. To his critics, however, he was a political firebrand whose populism sometimes threatened stability and whose uneasy alliances with former rivals blurred the line between reformer and opportunist. Both views were true in part. Together, they captured the paradox of Raila Odinga. This is the Raila Odinga story. He was born a fighter, descended from a lineage of warriors and leaders. His great-grandfather was a legend among the Luo people, remembered for bringing down an elephant on his own. Anyways, Raila Amolo Odinga was born on January 7, 1945 in Maseno, Kisumu County in western Kenya. His father, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, was one of the architects of Kenya's independence and the country's first vice president. Yet, like his son, Jaramogi's dream of the presidency would always remain out of reach. Jaramogi's break with President Jomo Kenyatta in 1966 created one of Kenya's first great political rifts. Their differences grew so deep that Jaramogi was detained in 1969 and imprisoned for almost 2 years. Watching his father's persecution left a deep impression on Raila, shaping both his defiance and his mistrust of absolute power. Anyways, for his education, Raila left Kenya to study in East Germany, earning a master's degree in mechanical engineering and experiencing life in both communist and capitalist worlds. Remember, this was the Cold War era. He often crossed Checkpoint Charlie with his Kenyan passport, carrying Western luxuries such as watches and radios for friends on the eastern side of Germany. Years later, inspired by the speech from Fidel Castro, he named his firstborn son after the Cuban leader. "I've lived on both sides of the world," he later said, "and that gives me an understanding most people only read about." Returning to Kenya in 1970, Raila became a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. Alongside teaching, he built a thriving manufacturing business, East African Spectre Limited. It was actually one of the few black-owned industrial ventures of its time. Later, Raila joined the Kenya Bureau of Standards, rising to deputy director by 1978. In actual fact, he was a promising technocrat whose path seemed set, but still, even then, politics pulled him into the struggle. In the 1970s and 1980s, Raila Odinga's political convictions began to harden. He supported reforms to open up Kenya's political space, challenging the grip of the ruling KANU party under President Daniel Arap Moi. His activism was dangerous in an era when dissent was treated as treason. In actual fact, this fight for multi-party democracy placed Raila in constant conflict with the state. His fight would cost him his freedom more than once. For instance, in 1982, after a failed coup attempt by a faction of Kenya's Air Force against Moi's government, Raila Odinga was accused of complicity and detained without trial. Raila Odinga spent the next 6 years moving between prisons, enduring conditions meant to crush his spirit. In one facility, deep inside a wildlife reserve, escape meant certain death among the predators. In another, Raila was kept in solitary confinement for weeks, blindfolded and beaten during interrogations at Nairobi's notorious Nyayo House. Raila later recounted the relentless abuse, psychological torment, and isolation he endured. His mother died in 1984, but the news was deliberately kept from him for 2 months. He also recounts how, in protest of his detention, he went on a hunger strike and would shout into the night so other prisoners knew he was still alive. "I wanted everyone to hear me," he said. "I refused to die quietly." That ordeal forced Raila's identity as a champion of democracy and resistance. Upon his release, he was arrested twice more for pushing to end one-party rule before finally fleeing to Norway in 1991. When Arab Moi's regime began to crumble in the early 1990s, Raila returned home as one of the key architects of Kenya's multi-party democracy. His fiery oratory, populist instinct, and deep connection with ordinary Kenyans made him a political force few could rival. In 1992, Raila won a seat in parliament under the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy Kenya, led by his father Jaramogi Odinga. After Jaramogi's death in 1994, Raila found himself in a power struggle within the party. 2 years later, he broke away and joined the National Development Party, the NDP, and this would set the stage for the next phase of his remarkable political journey. In 1997, Raila Odinga ran for president under the NDP but finished third. Still, he retained his parliamentary seat and used it to rebuild his influence. Also, instead of retreating into opposition, he made a bold and controversial move. He aligned himself with President Daniel Arap Moi and the ruling KANU party. In 2001, the two men sealed their cooperation through what became known as the first handshake. Raila would join Moi's government as Minister of Energy, a position that allowed him to expand Kenya's rural electrification program and strengthen his national profile. But anyways, critics also saw the alliance as a calculated play for succession, believing that Raila hoped to inherit Moi's political mantle. Unfortunately, the alliance crumbled in 2002 when Moi bypassed Raila and chose a young Uhuru Kenyatta as his preferred successor. Feeling betrayed, Raila led a mass defection from KANU, forming the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. Soon after, he and his allies joined forces with Mwai Kibaki to form the National Rainbow Coalition. This coalition united opposition groups against KANU's long rule. In this coalition, Raila's charisma and grassroots organizing proved very decisive. When Mwai Kibaki was badly injured in a car accident just weeks before the election, Raila Odinga's rallying cry, Kibaki Tosha, electrified the campaign. It became the slogan that carried the coalition to a historic victory, ending 4 decades of KANU dominance. As a reward, Raila was appointed Minister of Roads, Public Works and Housing in Kibaki's new government. But well, this alliance that had united them soon began to fracture. By 2005, the two leaders were openly at odds over proposed constitutional reforms. Raila spearheaded the No campaign, symbolized by the orange, against Kibaki's Yes faction. When the government lost the referendum, Raila's Orange movement transformed into a new political powerhouse, the Orange Democratic Movement, the ODM. It was through this party that Raila would face his defining political test, the disputed 2007 presidential election. In October 2007, Nairobi's Uhuru Park turned into a sea of orange. More than 50,000 supporters filled the grounds, chanting Raila Odinga's name as he launched his presidential campaign. The energy was electric, the air thick with hope. Opinion polls in the weeks that followed showed Raila leading President Mwai Kibaki in nearly every survey, though the race remained tight. Kenyans went to the polls on December 27. As votes were counted, Raila appeared to be ahead. But as the tallying continued, Kibaki's numbers suddenly surged. On December 30, behind closed doors, the head of the Electoral Commission announced Kibaki the winner by about 230,000 votes. And then days later, he admitted he was uncertain who had truly won. Almost instantly, Kenya erupted. Accusation of election theft spiraled into chaos. The violence spread fast, taking on ethnic overtones as old rivalries resurfaced. Raila's Luo supporters and Kibaki's Kikuyu base turned on each other. For 59 days, Kenya was gripped by bloodshed. More than 1,400 people were killed, and over 600,000 were forced from their homes. Peace only returned after former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan brokered a power-sharing deal in 2008. As part of this agreement, Raila Odinga became Prime Minister in a coalition government under President Mwai Kibaki. This uneasy partnership offered stability, but at certain times also turned bitter. For instance, Raila Odinga accused Kibaki of sidelining his ministers and boycotted cabinet meetings in protest. When he tried to suspend 2 ministers over corruption allegations, Kibaki overruled him, thus deepening the rift. Despite these tensions, Raila championed Kenya's 2010 constitution. It was a transformative document that strengthened devolution and entrenched multi-party democracy. This constitution was one of his proudest achievements. Yet by then, Odinga had also become a more complex figure, both an insider and an outsider, a reformer who had learned to navigate the system he once fought. In Kenya's delicate balance of power, every president learned to accommodate Odinga, not just as a rival, but as a force no one could ignore. Ahead of the 2013 elections, Raila Odinga's ODM built a new coalition, the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy, CORD. Raila ran as CORD's presidential candidate against Uhuru Kenyatta of the Jubilee Coalition in what became one of Kenya's most closely watched elections. After days of delays in vote tallying, Kenyatta was declared the winner with 50.07% of the vote, just enough to avoid a runoff. Raila had secured 43.31%. Citing irregularities in the process, Raila took his case to the Supreme Court but pledged to accept its verdict. When the court upheld Kenyatta's win, Raila conceded gracefully. 5 years later, in 2017, Raila once again stood for the presidency, this time leading the National Super Alliance, NASA. The election ended in yet another dispute, but this time history was made. The Supreme Court annulled the presidential results. It cited widespread irregularities and illegalities by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the IEBC. It was the first annulment of its kind in Africa. The court ordered a fresh election within 60 days, a decision held worldwide as a triumph for judicial independence. Raila, however, refused to participate in the rerun, arguing that no reforms had been made to guarantee fairness. His critics say it was a calculated political move, as participating risked another loss, while boycotting the elections entirely allowed him to keep his credibility and political leverage intact. With the opposition absent, voter turnout fell below 40%, and Kenyatta was declared the winner with 98% of the vote. Raila responded defiantly, holding a parallel swearing-in ceremony at Nairobi's Uhuru Park, where he declared himself the people's president.
I, Raila Odinga, in full realization of the high calling, assume the office of the people's president of the Republic of Kenya.
Months of protests and political unrest followed until March 9, 2018, when Kenya witnessed an unexpected turn, the famous handshake. Here, Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta publicly reconciled, pledging to work together to heal the nation's divisions, fight corruption, and address long-standing injustices. The handshake brought peace but also confusion. It blurred the boundaries between government and opposition and also split Raila's loyal base. But anyways, together, the two leaders unveiled the Building Bridges Initiative, a proposed constitutional reform meant to promote inclusion and share power more equitably. But critics, however, saw it as an attempt to expand executive authority. Anyways, when Kenya headed to the polls again in 2022, Uhuru Kenyatta backed Raila as his preferred successor. But despite the establishment's support, Raila once again lost, this time to William Ruto. Once again, he alleged electoral manipulation, but the Supreme Court upheld William Ruto's victory. This occasion marked Raila's fifth failed bid for the presidency, and yet another chapter in his extraordinary political journey. The man didn't give up that easily. In his later years, Raila Odinga became a respected elder statesman, admired even by his former rivals. In 2025, President William Ruto appointed him to help mediate the crisis in South Sudan, and this was a sign of trust and recognition for his long public service. Raila also turned his attention to the continent. In 2024, he ran for the chairmanship of the African Union Commission, hoping to guide Africa's leadership toward greater unity and reform. Unfortunately, he lost to Djibouti's Mahamoud Ali Yusuf. Baba Raila Amolo Odinga died on 15 October 2025, aged 80, while receiving treatment in India. This ended a political journey that spanned 6 decades and shaped Kenya's democracy. In a national address, Kenya's President William Ruto described Odinga as a once-in-a-generation leader, a giant of democracy, and a patriot who gave everything to better Kenya. Rest in peace, Raila Odinga. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.